They demanded he tear down the shed his father built decades ago, claiming it violated rules their HOA didn't even exist to enforce. Jack Wilson, a veteran and devoted father, stood stunned as Karen Stanton, the HOA's iron-fisted chairwoman, coldly dismissed his history and family legacy. "Rules are rules," she sneered, wielding her authority as though it was unquestionable. What she didn't know was that Jack held the key to unraveling her web of control. Proof that would not only protect his property, but also expose Karen's misuse of power. The fight that followed would shock the entire neighborhood and change their community forever. But let's start from the beginning. Jack Wilson, a 55-year-old veteran, enjoyed the kind of life many dream of. A cozy home nestled in a quiet suburban neighborhood, where days were marked by the cheerful chirping of birds and evenings spent reminiscing with his wife, Sarah, on their porch. In the backyard stood a weathered but sturdy shed, built by Jack's father over 40 years ago. To Jack, it wasn't just a structure, it was a time capsule, a piece of family history, and a reminder of simpler times when he and his father worked side by side, laying each plank with care and love. The shed had seen countless summer projects, family gatherings, and moments of quiet reflection. Its faded wood bore the marks of age, yet it stood proud, a testament to the Wilson family's legacy. Jack often told his kids, "This isn't just a shed, it's a piece of our family's soul." But as idyllic as life seemed, everything changed one fateful morning. Jack found a crisp envelope in his mailbox, bearing the logo of the Homeowners Association, HOA. Unfolding the letter, he felt his heart sink. The HOA claimed his shed violated architectural standards of the community and demanded its removal within 30 days. The kicker? If Jack failed to comply, he'd face a staggering $500 fine for every day of delay. Jack stormed into the kitchen, waving the letter in frustration. "This is outrageous!" he exclaimed, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Sarah, can you believe this? They're saying our shed, is against their precious rules. But this thing's been here longer than they've existed." Sarah, standing by the stove, her hand wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee, glanced at the letter and frowned. "Jack, this doesn't make any sense. They can't just decide this now after all these years. You should talk to them." Jack nodded, though his jaw was set in a way that betrayed his rising anger. "I'll call them, but I have a feeling this is more than just a misunderstanding." The name at the bottom of the letter didn't help his mood. Karen Stanton, the HOA chairwoman. Karen had a reputation in the neighborhood. With her meticulously maintained garden and an attitude that suggested she ran the neighborhood like a queen ruling her kingdom, Karen was a force to be reckoned with. Some neighbors joked that she spent more time enforcing HOA rules than enjoying her own life. Others whispered that she was always looking for a reason to flex her authority. Jack picked up the phone and dialed the HOA office. After a brief hold, Karen herself answered, her tone clipped and businesslike. "Mr. Wilson," she began, not waiting for Jack to speak, "I trust you've received our notice. The shed must go. It's non-compliant with community standards, and we take these matters seriously." Jack inhaled deeply, trying to keep his temper in check. "Miss Stanton, with all due respect, that shed has been on this property for over 4 decades. It was here before your HOA even existed. Surely, there's been a mistake." Karen didn't miss a beat. "Rules are rules, Mr. Wilson. It doesn't matter when the shed was built. If it doesn't meet our standards, it has to be removed. I suggest you comply before the fines start adding up." The line went silent for a moment as Jack processed her words. Finally, he replied, his voice firm. "I'm not taking down that shed without a fight. It's part of my family's history, and I won't let some arbitrary rules erase that." Karen's response was cold and final. "That's your decision, Mr. Wilson. But I assure you, the HOA has the authority to enforce compliance." As Jack hung up the phone, his hands trembled. Not from fear, but from the sheer injustice of it all. Turning to Sarah, he said, "They're not going to back down, but neither am I." The tension in the house was palpable. Outside, the shed stood resolute under the morning sun, as if echoing Jack's determination. Little did he know, this was just the beginning of a battle that would test not only his principles, but also his resolve to protect what truly mattered. And so the storm began to brew. A battle of wills between a man determined to defend his family's legacy and an HOA chairwoman bent on enforcing her vision of perfection. Jack Wilson wasn't the kind of man to back down from a fight, but he also believed in fairness. If there was a way to resolve this without unnecessary conflict, he would take it. With that thought, he reached out to the HOA, determined to explain his case. The phone call began politely enough. Jack calmly explained that his shed had stood on the property for decades, long before the HOA was even formed. He hoped that this would end the matter, but Karen Stanton, the chairwoman of the HOA, had other plans. Her voice was as cool and detached as a winter breeze. "Hey, Mr. Wilson," she said, "if you can't provide official documentation proving the shed's construction date, it will be considered non-compliant. Rules are rules." Jack felt a familiar frustration rising in his chest, but he kept his tone steady. "Karen, you and I both know that shed has been here longer than your HOA. Surely you can see this isn't a fair situation." But Karen didn't budge. "The burden of proof lies with you, Mr. Wilson. Until then, the shed remains in violation. I suggest you start making plans to remove it." Jack hung up, his mind racing. He knew Karen wasn't interested in compromise. She wanted submission. "If it's proof she wants, proof she'll get," he muttered under his breath. He spent the next several evenings in his basement, combing through old boxes and folders. The air was thick with the smell of aged paper and dust, but Jack pressed on. Each box he opened felt like unearthing a piece of his family's history, old photos, faded receipts, and yellowed documents that told the story of a life well lived. But despite hours of searching, he found nothing that specifically documented the shed's construction. Jack leaned back against the cold concrete wall, feeling the weight of frustration and exhaustion. "This can't be it," he thought. Then a knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. It was his neighbor, Mr. Roberts, an older man with a kind face and an encyclopedic knowledge of the neighborhood's history. "Heard you're having some trouble with the HOA," Roberts said, stepping inside. Jack explained the situation, and Roberts listened intently. After a moment of thought, he snapped his fingers. "Jack, I think I remember that shed being mentioned in an old article from the local paper. It was part of a feature on your dad's work in the community. If I'm right, that could help you." Hope sparked in Jack's chest. The next day, the two men headed to the local library to dig through archives. Hours later, they found it. A faded article from the late 1970s, complete with a photograph of Jack's father standing proudly next to the newly built shed. The caption read, "Local craftsman builds backyard retreat, a testament to family values and hard work." Jack couldn't help but smile. This was exactly what he needed. With a copy of the article in hand, he felt a surge of determination. But Karen wasn't one to admit defeat so easily. Before Jack could present his findings, she began spreading rumors throughout the neighborhood. Whispered conversations painted Jack as a troublemaker who refused to follow the rules. Some neighbors, previously friendly, started to avoid him. Others received letters from the HOA with sudden, suspiciously timed fines for minor infractions, overgrown lawns, improperly stored trash bins, things no one had ever been fined for before. It was clear Karen was using her position to isolate Jack and make him seem like the bad guy. The atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted, growing tense and uncomfortable. Jack's once warm community began to feel like a battleground, with invisible lines drawn between those who supported him and those who feared retaliation from the HOA. Jack stood in his backyard that evening, staring at the shed bathed in the golden glow of the setting sun. It had weathered storms, years of wear, and now, it seemed, it would face its biggest challenge yet. "This isn't just about the shed anymore," Jack said to himself. "This is about standing up for what's right." Jack realized it was time to bring in legal help. He contacted Susan Grant, a sharp attorney known for taking on unfair cases. After reviewing the article Jack had found, Susan dug into the HOA's records. A few days later, she had good news. The HOA wasn't established until 1995, nearly 2 decades after the shed was built. "This is solid evidence," Susan told him. "They have no legal grounds to demand its removal." Jack presented the findings to Karen Stanton, expecting her to acknowledge the mistake. Instead, her tone was icy. "Rules apply to all structures, no matter when they were built," she said. It was clear she wasn't backing down. Then, a twist. One of Jack's neighbors anonymously shared Karen's letter with local journalist Jessica Moore. Intrigued, Jessica interviewed Jack, who shared the shed's history and his frustration with the HOA's overreach. Jessica's article, titled "Veteran Fights HOA to Save His Family Legacy," gained traction quickly. Comments poured in, supporting Jack and criticizing the HOA's actions. Encouraged, Jack's neighbors began sharing their own grievances with the HOA, creating a wave of community support. Jack stood by his shed that evening, feeling the shift. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, he knew he wasn't alone. With the truth on his side and growing public pressure, he was ready for whatever came next. Jack walked into the courtroom with Susan Grant by his side, clutching a folder of evidence. The room buzzed with quiet murmurs as neighbors and curious onlookers filled the seats, eager to witness the showdown. This wasn't just about a shed anymore. It was about standing up to a system that many believed had gone too far. Susan began her case with precision and clarity. She laid out the timeline, showing the archived article that confirmed Jack's father had built the shed in 1978, nearly 2 decades before the HOA's existence. Then she presented the HOA's registration documents, proving their lack of authority over the structure. The courtroom fell silent as she introduced testimonies from neighbors, some of whom had lived in the area long before the HOA and attested to the shed's long-standing presence. Karen Stanton sat stiffly at the defense table, her expression unwavering. When it was her turn to speak, she claimed the shed diminished the aesthetic appeal of the neighborhood and argued that its presence could lower property values. Her voice was steady, but the room could sense the growing cracks in her argument. Susan countered sharply. "Miss Stanton, are you suggesting that a structure predating your organization is somehow subject to rules it could never have agreed to? This isn't about aesthetics, it's about overreach." The turning point came when Susan presented financial records obtained during discovery. They showed questionable transactions, including large sums withdrawn from HOA funds for miscellaneous expenses. As she detailed these findings, the courtroom buzzed with disbelief. Under cross-examination, Karen's composure faltered. When pressed about the transactions, she stumbled over her words, failing to provide clear answers. The evidence spoke for itself. Karen had been using HOA funds for personal expenses under the guise of community improvements. The judge, a stern but fair man, delivered his verdict with a clear and commanding tone. "The demands placed on Mr. Wilson are without merit. The shed predates the HOA's authority and is exempt from its regulations. Furthermore, the evidence presented regarding the misuse of funds warrants further investigation. The court orders the HOA to pay Mr. Wilson compensation for emotional distress and cover his legal fees." The room erupted into murmurs as Karen sat frozen, her face pale. Jack let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in weeks. Susan gave him a reassuring pat on the back. Outside the courthouse, neighbors approached Jack to offer congratulations and apologies. Some admitted they had feared retaliation from Karen but now felt inspired by his courage. Standing in the glow of the setting sun, Jack looked at Susan and smiled. "We did it," he said simply. Susan nodded. "You stood your ground, Jack, and you reminded everyone here that no one is above fairness and the law." The fight was over and justice had prevailed. Jack's shed, a symbol of family and resilience, would stand tall for years to come. A reminder that some battles are worth fighting. The aftermath of the trial brought a sense of closure to Jack Wilson's fight, but it also marked a new chapter for the community. Karen Stanton, the once intimidating chairwoman of the HOA, quietly stepped down from her position. Her departure wasn't accompanied by the bluster she had once commanded, but rather by an air of defeat. For many residents, it was a long overdue change. Shortly after, the newly appointed HOA leadership reached out to Jack with an olive branch. In a public statement, they acknowledged the mishandling of his case and issued an apology. At a community meeting, the new chairperson, a soft-spoken and reasonable man named Greg Harlow, addressed the issue directly. "We deeply regret the unnecessary conflict caused by our former policies," Greg said, his tone genuine. "Jack's story has shown us the importance of transparency and fairness. We are committed to revising our guidelines to prevent similar issues in the future." Jack, sitting among his neighbors, felt a wave of emotions: relief, validation, and a quiet pride. For weeks, his battle had consumed his thoughts, but now there was a sense that something good had come from it all. Back home, Jack walked out to his shed, now a symbol of his perseverance. The sun cast a warm glow over the weathered wood, highlighting every crack and detail that told the story of decades past. He placed a small plaque near the door, inscribed with simple but powerful words: "Here stands the Wilson legacy, protected by truth." The plaque wasn't just for Jack or his family, it was for anyone who passed by, a quiet reminder that standing up for what's right can inspire change. Jack's victory resonated far beyond his backyard. His story, which had spread through local news and online platforms, encouraged others to speak out against injustices in their own communities. Messages of support poured in from people near and far, sharing their gratitude and recounting their own experiences. One letter stood out to Jack. It was from a young couple in a neighboring town who had been facing similar struggles with their HOA. "Your fight gave us the courage to stand up for ourselves," they wrote. "Thank you for showing us that persistence and truth can prevail." As the days turned into weeks, Jack noticed a shift in his neighborhood. The once divided community began to come together. Neighbors who had once kept their distance now stopped by to chat or share a smile. The atmosphere, once heavy with tension, felt lighter. One evening, as Jack sat with Sarah on the porch, sipping iced tea and watching the sunset, she turned to him with a warm smile. "You didn't just save the shed, Jack," she said. "You reminded all of us what it means to stand up for what's right." Jack nodded, his gaze fixed on the shed. "It's more than just a fight for me," he replied. "It's about showing that no matter how small you feel against the odds, the truth will always have its day." And so, the shed remained, standing tall as a testament to resilience and justice, a piece of the Wilson family history that no one could take away. It was a story Jack's children would tell, a legacy that would inspire for generations to come.